On the morning of April 14th, Patton's convoy rolled through a town called Edenkoben. A routine advance, another road, another ruined village. But then one of his scouts radioed in. His voice was strange, not tactical, not clipped the way soldiers are trained to me. It was something else, something closer to horror. Patton's jeep stopped at a wire fence on the edge of a field. He stepped out. He looked. Then he saw it. Patton stopped. Then he saw it. What he found behind that wire would make a four-star general, a man who had crossed North Africa, Sicily, and France without flinching, stand completely still. This is what he did. We tell stories where disrespect meets consequences. If that's the kind of history you're here for, subscribe. Every story on this channel ends with accountability. To understand what Patton found that morning, you have to understand what was happening just a few kilometers away. While American soldiers were dying in the mud of Western Europe, certain German officers, particularly those commanding prisoner-of-war camps, had built themselves something remarkable. Comfort, SS Hauptsturmführer, the commanding officer of the POW labor detachment stationed in the Edenkoben district, had requisitioned the finest house in the town, a three-story estate with a garden, a wine cellar, and paintings on the walls that didn't belong to him. He ate hot meals. He drank wine from bottles stamped with French vineyard names. He slept on linen sheets. Meanwhile, under his command, somewhere between 200 and 300 American prisoners of war had been held in an open field compound for nearly 6 weeks. No barracks, no roof, no beds. They slept in holes they dug with their bare hands, covered with whatever rags they could find. Coat liners, torn tent scraps, burlap sacks. The Red Cross packages that were legally required to be delivered under the Geneva Convention, Blake had confiscated them. All of them, not distributed, not delayed, confiscated. Some packages were found later stacked in a storage room in his estate, unopened, labeled with the names of American soldiers who were, at that very moment, starving. The ration system Blake ran for his prisoners was not a ration system. It was theater. A few spoonfuls of watery turnip broth every other day. Occasionally, a heel of stale bread. Sometimes nothing at all. The prisoners had been in his custody since late February. By April, many of them couldn't stand up straight. Some had stopped trying. And that morning, the morning Patton's convoy rolled through, some of those men were on their hands and knees, eating the grass. Not because they'd lost their minds. Because their bodies had lost the war. Their captors had already won at the mess table. Patton's aide, Captain Chester Hansen, was the first one through the gate. He described it later in his journal with a single sentence. I have never, in my life, wanted to look away from something American. The men inside the compound were barely recognizable as soldiers. Their uniforms, what remained of them, hung like shed skins. Fabric so worn it had become translucent in places. Shoulder insignia faded to ghost marks. Some sat against a low stone wall, eyes half open, watching the Americans arrive the way men watch something they're not sure is real. Some didn't move at all. Sergeant First Class Harlan Doss of the 90th Infantry later gave a sworn statement. He said, I walked up to one of the men. He was on his knees, and I thought at first he'd been shot. Then I saw what he was doing. He was pulling grass from the ground and putting it in his mouth. Slowly, like it mattered. I said, Hey, soldier. He looked up at me, and he said, real quiet, Is it over? I couldn't answer him for a second, because I didn't know what he was asking. Is the war over, or is it over for me? Patton asked the first medic who reached the scene how long the men had been in this condition. The medic said, probably 3 weeks at minimum. Some showed signs of longer. Patton asked him to be specific. The medic said that based on the muscle atrophy, the way the tendons in their arms looked, some of these men may not have had a real meal in over a month. Patton didn't respond. He turned and looked at his intelligence officer. One word, where? The officer pointed toward a tree line about 400 meters away. The rooftop of a large estate was just visible above the branches. Inside that house, at that very moment, SS Hauptsturmführer Blake was eating breakfast. According to the German orderly who was later questioned, the meal consisted of eggs. Real eggs, not powdered, toasted bread with butter, sliced meat, and hot coffee. A fire was lit. The plates were porcelain. There was a newspaper folded at the corner of the table. Outside, 400 meters through the trees, the men under his charge were eating the ground. Among the prisoners was a 22-year-old from Knoxville, Tennessee, Private First Class Roy Alden. Roy had been a schoolteacher before the war. He'd been captured near the Saar River in February. When medics reached him, they recorded his weight, 97 pounds. He had entered captivity at 168. In 6 weeks, under Blake's command, Roy Alden had lost over 70 pounds. One of the medics offered him a ration bar. Roy looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up. He said, "Is there a real piece of bread? I just want to taste bread." Patton turned to his aide. His voice, witnesses later said, was completely calm. That was the part that frightened people most. Not the anger, the quiet. He said, "Bring me the man who runs this." What happened next happened in under 20 minutes. That is how fast George Patton moved when he had decided something. 2 jeeps and a command vehicle pulled up to the iron gate of the Blake estate. MPs jumped out before the vehicle stopped rolling. They didn't knock. They didn't announce. The front door came open from the inside. A German enlisted orderly, young, pale, saw the helmet stars and immediately stepped back. Patton walked to his own front door as if the building already belonged to America. Blake was still at the breakfast table when Patton entered the dining room. By some accounts, he stood up immediately. By others, he had to be told twice. Patton looked at the table. He looked at the eggs. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the newspaper. He didn't say anything about any of it, he said. "How many men are in that field?" Blake answered in German. His interpreter translated, 263 registered prisoners, sir." Patton said, "When did they last eat a full meal?" Blake paused. That pause said everything. Patton then did something unexpected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his ivory-handled pistol, which was famous and very real and very visible, on his hip. He pulled out a chair at Blake's breakfast table. He sat down. He looked at Blake for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Tell me what you ate this morning." It was not a casual question. It was not a casual question. It was a prosecutor's question. Blake listed the items. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who understood suddenly that every word was evidence. Patton listened to all of it. Then he said, "Those men are going to eat now, and you are going to watch." He stood up. He said, "And then we are going to have a much longer conversation about the Geneva Convention." He walked out. Within the hour, Patton had ordered every field kitchen unit in range to converge on Edenkoben. He ordered medical teams to assess every single prisoner individually and document their condition in writing. He ordered photographers forward. Everything was to be recorded, every face, every wound, every weight, every name, because Patton already knew what this was going to be used for, not just justice, evidence. Then came the part that people who were there never forgot. Patton ordered Blake to stand at the gate, not in a cell, not in a truck, not yet, at the gate, in full view of every man he had starved. Some of the prisoners saw him and looked away. They were too weak for anger. Some didn't recognize him, but some did. One man, accounts differed who, looked through the wire at Blake standing there in his clean uniform with his pressed collar and said nothing. He just stared, for a long time, until a medic gently touched his shoulder and offered him food. And that man, whoever he was, turned away from Blake and toward the food. And that man, whoever he was, turned away from Blake and toward the food. That, Patton later said, was the most powerful thing he witnessed that entire day. He chose life over revenge. That's more dignity than his captor ever showed him. The food came in waves, carefully, because starved men cannot eat heavily at first without their bodies rejecting it. The medics knew this. They managed it with precision. Soup, broth, soft bread, small portions, given with hands, not thrown. One medic, Private Thomas Kulik from Pittsburgh, later wrote home, "I held a cup for a man who couldn't lift his arms. He drank every drop. Then he looked at me and said thank you, like I'd done something extraordinary. I hadn't done anything. I just handed him a cup." That's what they've been reduced to, where a cup of soup felt like a miracle. Over the next 72 hours, the Edenkoben compound was transformed. Under Patton's direct orders, the prisoners received around-the-clock medical care, fluid replacement, caloric refeeding protocols. Vitamin injections were available. Every man was examined, every injury logged, every act of neglect recorded in a legal document that would eventually travel up the chain of command all the way to the War Crimes Tribunal offices. Patton did not leave immediately. He stayed. He walked through the medical area. He spoke to the metal, not as a general giving a speech, quietly, one at a time. He asked their names. He asked where they were from. Private First Class Roy Alden, the 22-year-old schoolteacher from Knoxville, who had weighed 97 pounds, was in the second row of cots. He was sitting up. He had a piece of actual bread in his hands. Patton stopped at his cot. He looked at the bread. He looked at Roy. He said, "You a fighter, son?" Roy said, "West." "Yes, sir. I'm a teacher, actually. But I fought," Patton said. "That's the same thing." He moved on. Roy later said in a 1972 oral history interview, "I didn't cry when the Americans arrived. I didn't cry during any of it. But when that old general stopped and talked to me like I was a person, like I was still a person, that's when I lost it. Because for 6 weeks, I'd been treated like I wasn't." Werner Bleich was formally arrested on the afternoon of April 14, 1945. He was charged with violations of the Geneva Convention, specifically willful denial of food and medical care to prisoners of war, unlawful confiscation of Red Cross relief packages, negligence resulting in severe bodily harm to prisoners under his charge. The evidence was extensive. The confiscated Red Cross boxes alone, found stacked in his storage rooms, untouched, constituted proof of calculated cruelty, not administrative failure. This was not a man who forgot. This was a man who chose. Bleich was held in military custody, transferred to the War Crimes Investigation Unit, and eventually tried in the post-war proceedings. He was convicted, sentenced to 12 years. He served 8. Some people, when they hear that, say it wasn't enough. Maybe it wasn't. But here's what else happened. The documentation that Patton ordered, the photographs, the medical records, the sworn statements, became part of a larger body of evidence used to prosecute dozens of other German officers across the region. Patton's decision to stay, to document, to photograph the men's faces and record their names. That decision meant that what happened in Edenkoben did not stay in Edenkoben. It traveled. It testified. Roy Alden returned to Knoxville in August 1945. He went back to teaching the following January. He taught 7th grade history for 29 years. He never talked about what happened to his students. But every year, without fail, in the unit on World War II, he spent one full class period on the Geneva Convention. What it says, what it requires, why it exists. He never explained why that specific lesson mattered to him. He didn't need to. This wasn't just a story about food. It wasn't even really a story about Patton. It was a story about what power does when no one is watching. Bleich had power over those men. Complete, absolute, institutional power. And he used it the way certain people always use unchecked power. To take, to consume, to diminish. He ate eggs while men ate dirt. He slept on linen while men slept in holes they dug with their hands. And he believed, because men like that always believe, that he would never be held accountable, that the rules didn't apply to him, that dignity was a privilege he could assign or deny as he chose. And then one morning, a convoy came down a road. A man stepped out of a jeep, and accountability arrived. Not with a speech, not with fury, with a question asked quietly at a breakfast table. When did they last eat a full meal? The silence that followed that question was its own verdict. Some silences are confessions. This one was, "Here's the question I want to leave you with. If you had been in that compound, if you had watched what happened to those men, and you later heard that Bleich served 8 years and was released, would that be enough for you? Leave your answer in the comments. Seriously, I read every one. And if this kind of history matters to you, stories where someone finally says enough, subscribe. We find the moments history almost forgot. We make sure they're not forgotten. See you in the next one.